All right, we've experienced our first college closure of the semester. Congratulations! As mentioned on the first day, anytime the college is closed, we will continue our class as outlined in the schedule of instruction. The way these recordings work is this. Be sure you have something to write with and on, including your Jeopardy list, as these are your class notes for the concepts, and it's a good idea to have your textbook handy since I will refer to it during the lesson. We will not review the recorded lesson in class, nor will I reteach the concepts. It is your responsibility to listen to this lesson prior to our next class meeting. Be sure to jot down any questions you have, as I am happy to answer any questions regarding clarification on a concept. We learned last week that psychology is a science for good reason, to move away from opinion toward empirical data that is based on factual evidence. And by using the scientific method, we also avoid bias and error. This semester, we'll be talking about human development within the context of 3 domains as outlined on page 7. Biosocial, physical bodily growth; cognitive, how we process and use information; and psychosocial, emotions, social skills, and relationships. Now, we've been talking a lot about Jessica Cox and what she teaches us about human development. In looking at her life, we must be really careful not to make what we call the difference equals deficit error. You can see this on page 10. Because Jessica deviates from what we call the norm, does not make her inferior, nor should her differences be viewed as problems. Plasticity, as defined on page 20, helps to explain Jessica's fantastic abilities. Plasticity is also on your Jeopardy list, and it's defined on page 20. So one concept from Chapter 1 that we should discuss in class together is one of your first theories, Urie Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems approach. I want to ensure that we have adequate class time to discuss this theory and address any questions you may have. Let's move on to talk about how we put the scientific method into practice in the field of human development. We'll start with observation. Observation studies involve unobtrusively watching and recording behavior, pretty much people watching. Through naturalistic observation, we simply watch people's behavior unfold in a natural setting. There's no interference. If we use scientific observation, we could use a lab to observe, which would obviously change the person's behavior. This is called the observer effect, when people change their behavior or act differently because they know they are being watched. Another limitation of observation is that it does not tell us why people do what they do, so it does not give us the cause of a behavior. Experiments, research method number 2, are designed in a manner to allow us to determine a cause and effect relationship. Make yourself a note that this is the only research method that determines cause and effect. There are several components of an experiment. You must gather a representative sample of participants and then randomly divide them into at least 2 groups. The participants in the experimental group have something done to them. They receive what we call the independent variable. The folks in the control group receive no special treatment. They don't receive the independent variable. In talking about variables, the independent variable is whatever it is that the experimenter is manipulating. So it is the variable that I would intentionally manipulate as the researcher. On the other hand, the dependent variable is the outcome, what we measure, that may change depending on the independent variable. So an experiment compares your experimental group to the control group. Does the independent variable result in a different outcome for the 2 groups? When we see differences between the experimental and control groups are greater than chance, they are considered to be significant, and we can easily review an example of this in class if you just ask. And next one, the third one, is a case study. This is an in-depth study of one person. The advantage is you get a lot of rich detail about that person, but the disadvantage is that it does not generalize or translate to everyone else. In addition to observations and experiments, surveys, on page 24, are often used to collect data. We usually think of written questionnaires as surveys, and they are, but interviews are also a type of survey. While using a survey allows you to collect a large amount of data from a large group of people fairly quickly, respondents often don't tell the truth, and it's really difficult to write good questions that truly assess what you want to know. So 4 common ways of collecting research data are observations, experiments, surveys, and case studies. The study of human development, however, requires something more. We are interested in how people change or remain the same over time. There are 3 basic research designs that allow for this type of investigation. They are cross-sectional research, longitudinal research, and the cross-sequential research. Turn with me to page 25. This is easier to understand if you have a visual example. Cross-sectional research, what you're looking at on screen now, compares groups of people of different ages, but who are similar in other important ways. This is the quickest way to study changes over the lifespan. An example might be a researcher is interested in finding out whether children's ability to use self-control when they're offered unhealthy food changes with age. So he asked parents of 3-year-olds, parents of 6-year-olds, and parents of 9-year-olds to bring their children to the lab. When there, they are allowed to eat as much candy, cookies, and cake as they want, and the researcher then compares the amount of food eaten by children of the 3 different ages. The problem with cross-sectional research is that differences might be due to difference in background instead of due to developmental differences. This is called cohort differences, and a cohort is just a group of people who were born at about the same time and they move through life together, experiencing the same historical events and cultural shifts at about the same age. For example, if you were interested in how computer ability changes with age, and you used a cross-sectional study, you might examine the computer skills of 14-year-olds, 24-year-olds, 34-year-olds, and 44-year-olds. The difference may not have anything to do with development or ability, but might have more to do with exposure and background. All right, let's switch. In longitudinal research, a researcher follows the same people for long periods of time. This helps us determine whether differences are due to age instead of cohort differences. Basically, you keep collecting data on the same people as they grow up. For example, if you wanted to study the development of handwriting ability in children, you could measure their handwriting of a group of 2nd graders and then continue taking handwriting samples from these children each year until they are in the 6th grade. Obviously, this type of research can take a long time. Another method is cross-sequential research. Cross-sequential research is a sort of combination of longitudinal and cross-sectional. It is very time-consuming and very complex, but it probably gives the best information about development. As you see on screen, it is similar to doing longitudinal studies on 2 or more groups of people who have similar qualities. Most importantly, as we conduct research in the field of human development, we must adhere to a strict code of ethics as outlined by the American Psychological Association, or APA. First, just like the medical field, we can do no harm, regardless of whether the harm is physical or psychological. Using deception is okay as long as it incurs no harm and you let your participants know about the deception and why during a debriefing. All participants, including children, must give informed consent. Usually, you develop a form that outlines the goals of the study and you let participants know about any involved risks. They decide whether or not they want to participate and usually give consent by way of signature. If a child cannot give consent, a parent can give consent. However, when a child is old enough and competent enough to understand what it means to give consent, you must have both the child and the parent's consent. Also, participants' participation in your study is completely voluntary. They can walk away at any time, even if your study is not complete. Any information they give you is confidential and should be secured properly. You cannot identify participants by name in your research report, nor share their information with anyone else. After your study is complete, you must conduct a debriefing. This is a meeting during which you explain your study, its goals, any rationale for using deception if you used it, and you answer participants' questions. Leave your participants feeling good they have participated in your research. Listen to them and address any concerns they may have. No matter how your results turn out, never falsify the data or distort findings to make them look more important than they are. Even if the research study didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, we can still learn from that, and it's valuable. Falsifying and cooking data hurts the field of human development, it's unethical, and it can cost you your job and even your licensure and credentials. So that's all for Chapter 1, other than discussing Bronfenbrenner in class. I want you to be prepared by listening to this before our next class and jot down any questions you may have.